Hello and welcome to the first episode of DG Competition's new debate series, Let's Talk Competition. The idea is to discuss some of our policy and enforcement work with stakeholders from private practice, from business, from academia, and from civil society. The debates will be live streamed on our website and on our YouTube channel, and you will have the possibility to ask questions via Slido. So today, we launched this new series with a discussion on Article 102, and more episodes on equally interesting topics are already in the making. So watch this space. And now I hand over to Louis and his group of distinguished guests.
Hello, thank you, Alexander. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this first edition of Let's Talk Competition. My name is Lewis Crofts, and I'll be moderating today. So what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about antitrust. In March, the European Commission put forward a new initiative that looks into dealing with companies which have a lot of market power and use that power, or might use that power, to exclude rivals and competitors. So the package came in two parts. The first half was about a guidance paper from 2008. And the Commission is going to look again at that, or has looked again at that, has made some amendments, and that we're going to discuss some of those surgical changes to the paper. That paper set out the prioritization of cases, what the Commission would look for, or the kinds of cases it would look to take. The second part of the package is about some new guidelines. Guidelines are a step up in the food chain from guidance. And that document will come into force in 2025 after a long consultation, which you can all participate in. So that's what we're going to talk about. I've got a stellar panel with me to discuss it. I've got Linsey McCallum, who's Deputy Director-General responsible for antitrust at the European Commission. It's her policy area. She knows the package. She knows everything there is to know here. I've also got Professor Richard Whish, Emeritus Professor at King's College London. Richard has educated about half the world's competition lawyers, so he's going to give us an excellent academic perspective there. And I've also got Thomas Vinje. Thomas is Chairman Emeritus of Clifford Chance's Global Antitrust Practice. He's also an assistant professor at the University of Bergen and has been involved in, on or off, on one side or the other, most of the Article 102 cases of the last few decades. There's an important other participant, and that's you. That's you, the public at home. So you have a chance to put in questions via Slido. It's a platform. If you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching on DG Competition's website, the instructions to put in questions are below. Also, we'll flash up a QR code from time to time, and you can click on that and put in your questions. It's then up to me to put them to the panel towards the end. So first of all, we're going to hear from Linsey, who's going to set out the package, tell us what we need to know, we'll discuss some hot topics, and then we'll take your questions. But you can start putting them in to Slido now. So to start, Linsey, tell us, Article 102 doesn't get touched very often, so when it does, it's significant. What have you done, and why have you done it?
Well, thank you, Lewis. I think in essence, the Guidelines Initiative that we launched on the 27th of March has two broad aims. First, we want to systematise the significant but also complex case law on exclusionary abuses that we've seen develop since the guidance in 2008 that you mentioned. And I think our second broad aim was to give some more transparency in how our own enforcement practice in the Commission has developed, notably in the light of that jurisprudence. We launched a call for evidence in March, and we've seen around 50 replies. I think the reception of the initiative is generally positive, it would be fair to say. I think in particular, stakeholders see a benefit to the Commission setting out its own views, a statement of the law on exclusionary abuses under Article 102, and also a benefit, frankly, that document could be helpful in providing more coherence in the enforcement of 102 within our European competition network and also between national courts. But I think one of the really key messages that comes out of the replies already is that the debate is about how to conduct an effects-based approach under Article 102. The days of whether to do so, I think that's really behind us. And that makes sense, because after all, since 2008, we see the effects-based approach very much embedded in the jurisprudence. And our guidance from 2008, and indeed our quite active role as an enforcer, I think was helpful in moving the cursor in that direction. But I think what is equally true is there are different views on what an effects-based approach means in practice. And that's a clear message that's come out from stakeholders. And I think that's precisely why guidelines could be useful in providing some greater clarity for the future on how to go about an effects-based analysis under 102. I mean, this is an area that, as you say, I've also been dealing with for a while. And so I think if I ask myself the question round about what's an effects-based approach, I think it can be quite illustrative to look back at what's been happening in our markets over the last few years. You've seen a lot more concentration in markets, I mean, within the EU, but more generally. You've seen the emergence of some really big digital players, and if not emergence, then the retrenchment. And that's clearly had important economic impacts, but also much more broadly, societally. And from our enforcement work, I think we see that abusive conduct in digital, but also in other markets, can produce rather quickly negative effects in terms of innovation, in terms of differentiation. So we draw, I think, two broad conclusions from that. First, when we think about exclusionary abuses under Article 102, it's really important to make sure that we're taking a dynamic perspective to the analysis of effects. We see that dominant companies can feel very threatened by entrants, and when they feel threatened, they can put in place strategies to prevent entry or to impede growth. And the question they ask themselves in those circumstances really doesn't seem to be whether the competitor is as efficient as them in terms of cost structure. And I think that is for a fairly straightforward reason. Their concern is that the entrant might produce something that's really innovative, maybe a new product, maybe a new feature that could be really attractive to some or all of the dominant company's customers. And it's that could provide a springboard, if you like, for the entrant to really contest and perhaps even overturn the position of the incumbent. And that, for me, that sort of dynamics of competition is entirely in line with an effects-based approach to Article 102. I think it's really the heart of what we need to be doing. I'm pleased to see that it's reflected in the jurisprudence, and we'll certainly want to make sure that it's reflected in future guidelines. From an enforcer's perspective, I think the other thing we see, and I see that with our case teams, is that they're always keen to do a bit more, to send another request for information, to think about some more quantitative data, to get a few more internal documents to review. But Article 102 enforcement has such an important role in our societies that we have to make sure that there's a limit to what the enforcer needs to do to bring a case forward. So I think that concept of workability in terms of enforcement is also going to be close to our hearts when we think about future guidelines. And let me close maybe by saying a few words about why are we doing this now and why are we doing it in the two steps that you mentioned with the changes to the guidance and the prospective guidelines. Since 2008, I think we've seen some 32 judgments of the courts in Luxembourg on exclusionary abuses, so it's been a busy time. And that's after some 26 exclusionary decisions that the Commission has adopted, and of course our national competition authorities have not been absent from this space either. So if you look at that in the round, I think it's a good moment to take stock and to think about where we want to go in the future. Of course, we have some important judgments pending, but that is always going to be the case. And I certainly don't want to suggest that connecting all the dots in the case law and with our enforcement practice is going to be necessarily straightforward. But I think there could really be a value to taking stock and setting out for the future the principles that we think should be guiding our enforcement. And why amend the guidance in the meantime? I think we thought that it would be important to already communicate clearly on the ways in which our own enforcement practice has been affected over the years by the jurisprudence. I think that's good from a transparency perspective. And as you've said yourself, the road towards guidelines will be a long one. So I also hope that our changes to the guidance will be helpful in provoking some public debate. I'm looking forward to the rest of the debate here in precisely that spirit.
Thanks. Thomas, the road to guidelines would be a long one. There's also a long distance traveled behind us. And, you've been involved in cases, IBM and Microsoft and Google. Every decade brings a new one. How do you see the Commission's initiative fitting into that grand sweep of Article 102?
Decades of formalistic, almost mechanical antitrust law, where economics didn't really matter. I recall the IBM case, for example, the first big and challenging tech case was bereft of economics. I never saw an economist in that case. But then during the 1990s, a great debate, I'm sure Linsey will remember it, and certainly Richard as well, mainly within DG Comp. And it was eventually Comp, and not the courts, that led the revolution, and I think can be called a revolution, from a formalistic to an effects-based approach. And so the Commission led the way with new block exemptions, guidelines, its own case law. The first, I think, major 102 case with an effects-based analysis was Microsoft, where both the Commission and the courts looked closely at the effects of Microsoft's refusal to supply interoperability information and its tying the Windows media player with Windows. And soon after that, the Commission issued the 2008 guidelines we're talking about to some extent here today on its Article 102 enforcement priorities. And that guidance had a significant effect, a big effect, I think, on the trajectory that was taken not only by the Commission but by the courts. When presented with Commission decisions embodying an effects-based approach, the courts embraced it. So now we're firmly in the land of effects-based Article 102 jurisprudence. As Linsey indicates, we have a substantial body of case law. So I agree it's a good moment for the Commission to provide updated guidance about how it interprets the somewhat mixed case law. That should be useful not only to companies who have to comply with it, but for the courts as well. I think it'll be especially useful to have the Commission's interpretation of the case law on some really key issues. For example, what must be shown in terms of effects? And what are the evidentiary requirements associated with the effects-based approach? What is the relevance of efficiency of competitors? What constitutes competition on the merits? And to what extent is the Commission required, if at all, to undertake a counterfactual analysis? It seems to me the Commission's made a good start to the process. The 5 changes to the guidance appear to me to be a good faith attempt to chart the Commission's way through the court's judgments. The Commission clearly is not abandoning effects-based analysis. And looking forward, the 2025, assuming you make it, guidelines might well again set the trajectory for the development of the court's case law, just like the 2008 guidance did. But of course, it's up to the courts to confirm or reject the Commission's interpretations when the cases come before it. And wherever we end up in 2030 or 2040, I think we can assume that Article 102 will remain firmly lodged in effects land. The big question, which I think we'll come back to a bit, is whether the burdens placed upon the Commission might become so heavy as to render ineffective, to some extent, Article 102. I'm compelled to make one final point regarding the grand sweep that you requested I address. This new 102 initiative lives in a different environment because the DMA will be squatting on a significant part of the territory. And the DMA leaves little room for assessing economic effects. So I find it interesting, maybe a bit ironic, that in those areas governed by the DMA, we're going back to the past.
Thanks, Thomas. We've heard, Richard, from Thomas and Linsey that it's the right time to look at 102 again, but is the Commission on the right track? Is this what 102 needs?
Well, I very much welcome this initiative, and I think it's absolutely timely. I remember vividly the debate that led to the adoption of the guidance in 2008. And it was a hugely interesting time because, as we've already heard to some extent, in the 90s and then in the noughties, the Commission clearly wanted to steer competition enforcement towards a more effects-based approach. To begin with, they took a very close look at Article 101, and they adopted block exemptions, which were clearly more flexible, more rooted in economic theory. And then they wrote the accompanying vertical guidelines, horizontal cooperation guidelines that shifted things towards a more effects-based standard. And then, of course, we had the merger guidelines, horizontal guidelines in 2004, non-horizontal merger guidelines in 2007, very much rooted in economic theory. And a useful discussion of the kind of evidence that could be used in the substantive analysis of cases. But when it comes to Article 102, of course, the law is what the Court of Justice says it is. And insofar as the Commission or people within the Commission wanted to move things towards a more effects-based standard, if they then had adopted guidelines on the law, in a sense, they would have just been concretizing the very jurisprudence that there was a desire to move away from. So I always thought it was very astute to actually adopt guidance on enforcement priorities and to explain the kind of cases that the Commission thought would be worth running. Paragraph 20, I thought, of the guidance was very useful, discussing the kind of criteria that would be relevant in the selection of cases. I thought that was very astute. And what was interesting, and Thomas has said it, is that not only was that guidance on what the Commission was going to do, but it had a broader effect. It had a wider influence, and the courts themselves started referring to the guidance. So, a shift in direction had been achieved. But we're now 15 years on, and as Linsey have said, with 32 judgments on. And these judgments have discussed a range of different and complicated things in markets that are a long way from unripened bananas and Irish sugar and British plasterboard. So we are in a different space, and we've got much more material now to work on. So I think it is timely now to proceed to the adoption of guidelines rather than guidance. My final comment would be to say that I'm glad that we live in an effects-based world. I don't like formalism. But as Thomas has just said, we're now at the point where we have to say, what do we mean by effects analysis? And there are lots of issues there that have got to be unpacked. And I think they're precisely the things that future guidelines might be able to provide much more clarity on.
Thanks, Richard. We'll come on to that shortly. Linsey, going back to you, let's take the first half of your initiative, the guidance paper. You've done some surgery on it. You made a couple of amendments, a handful of amendments. Which ones would you pick out? Which are the ones which you think sort of really make a change?
Yeah. Look, I think these amendments to the guidance paper are valuable, even if they're clearly intermediate, because the concept here is that the guidelines will exist by 2025, and then obviously the guidance paper itself will be withdrawn. In terms of this interim period, I think there are two amendments that we've made that I'd highlight in particular. I think the first is round about the legal standard for establishing anti-competitive effects. Now, we're in the world of exclusionary conduct here, so we understand that we're talking about foreclosure, we're talking about the exclusion of rivals. There's not much debate to be had there. But it's clear that it's not just full foreclosure that we should be worried about. And there, I think, amongst the judgments that we've been referring to already, we've heard from the court that the concept of foreclosure is a broad one, and that there are also grounds for intervention where the abusive conduct of a dominant company is impacting the competitive structure of a market. So in other words, it's not just full foreclosure, it's not just eviction of competitors that we need to be concerned about. It's also the broader perspective of the weakening of the competitive process and what that could mean for the detriment of consumers. And the other area I would highlight is round about as efficient competitors. I think there have been few other aspects of the guidance from 2008 which have been as discussed. It's a subject that's come up again and again in our own enforcement practice. There's been a lot of ink spilt on it. And we are grateful now that we also have some guidance from Luxembourg for the future. And so this seemed like a good moment, if you like, to go back a little bit to first principles. And as my fellow panelists have already intimated, it's clear that the purpose of competition law is not to provide systemic protection for inefficient competitors. And at the same time, if we want to have a forward-looking, a dynamic approach to the analysis of effects, there are circumstances in which a competitor that is not yet as efficient as the dominant company, maybe because of scale or network effects, is worthy of protection. And I think that's a really critical issue, because if we were to be overly static, if we were to be overly formalistic, focus only on a snapshot of the here and now, I think that we would have a serious risk of under-enforcement. And of course, the other discussion topic round about as efficient competitor is about the use of price-cost tests. When is that appropriate? Here again, I think the courts have provided us with some really valuable guidance and made clear that, in particular, where the conduct at issue of a dominant company is pricing based, so it's about the price, it's not about the conditions attached to the price, then the use of these tests is entirely appropriate. So that's abuses like margin squeeze or predation. But what's equally clear, I think, is that these tests make a lot less sense in other circumstances. And I think that's particularly the case where the conduct at issue by its very nature has the capacity to restrict competition. I think the poster child example there would be a situation in which the rebates of a dominant company are conditioned on the customer taking the totality of its supplies from the dominant company. And there, again, the court has clarified that the test is not a necessity. So I hope, if you like, that the recalibration around these concepts in our amending communication is helpful, that it's helpful in terms of making clear that these tests are generally optional, that when we use price-cost tests, they constitute one piece of evidence, which has to be seen in the totality of the evidence at our disposal, whether that's quantitative or qualitative. And in that sense, I think we are coming back to first principles. The court tells us that when we're conducting our analysis, we need to look at all of the evidence that's on file. And I think price-cost tests, therefore, fit into that bucket of one piece of the evidence.
Thanks, Thomas. This is the effects-based approach, the clues in the name, effects. It's the regulator's job to prove those, and obviously that has caused an increasing level of sophistication over time. Some would say an increasing burden on the investigator to prove that. There's also a level of sophistication needed in the courts to be able to review that. And there have been some comments from investigators and from the judiciary that level is getting higher and higher and higher, and it's more and more difficult to prove a case. The wording from the policy brief that accompanies the initiative is unduly burdensome or even impossible. Would you say that it's got too difficult to do a 102 case?
Well, I don't think it's become impossible to pursue 102 cases. Both the Commission and the national authorities are finding infringements, and the courts are confirming some of those decisions. But enforcement certainly has become extremely burdensome, I think it's fair to say, as indeed highlighted by recent remarks by the President of the General Court. And depending on how they're developed, I do fear that there are certain elements of the recent case law that could render it, if not impossible, at least very difficult for the Commission to pursue at least what I would regard as some valid Article 102 cases. Let me address just a few points in this context. First, there's a vast disparity between the resources that the Commission has, and there's a huge information gap between what the Commission staff have and the information at the disposal of the relevant dominant companies. And that disparity is, of course, even bigger when it comes to national authorities. And I do think that disparity risks becoming potentially decisive in tipping the scales against appropriate enforcement if the court continues to impose greater and greater demands on the Commission. That's certainly not to say that the effects-based approach to Article 102 should be abandoned, and of course that's not what the Commission is proposing and not what the courts would allow. But it's worth perhaps focusing on a few of the concrete developments that might present that risk. And one, I think, is the procedural requirements that have been heaped on the Commission. Obviously, due process is vital, but having handled my fair share of 102 cases on both sides, I think the court has, perhaps not purposefully, enabled defendants to exploit their rights of defense, sometimes at least in ways that are not genuinely used to defend themselves on the substance, but rather to delay the cases. Leaving aside procedure, the case law risks, I think, in other ways rendering 102 ineffective. The whole question of how to deal with efficiencies, or efficiency, efficiency of competitors, which Linsey referred to, competitors of the dominant company, is a critical question. And while I think the case law is reasonably balanced in its current state, if it were taken in the direction that some wish, it could essentially eviscerate Article 102 in cases, some of the cases where its enforcement, I think, is most important. More generally, the courts have increased the intensity of existing Commission obligations. I think there's a risk that the courts will be demanding too much from the Commission with respect to the evidentiary requirements associated with the effects-based approach. I think it's, going back to where Linsey was, worth a few words on the expanding benefit of the doubt that is given to dominant companies regarding the capability of conduct to produce effects. And one context in which I think that is relevant is the AEC test. And there, in particular, as regards contestable share, an AEC test relies upon assumptions for which, by definition, there is no certain or definitive answer, only a best or reasonable estimate. So if the applicable evidentiary standard is that any assessment made in the context of an economic model is that it will fail if any doubt is raised in favor of the defendant, then the Commission seems almost bound, ipso facto, to lose any case where it has to rebut an AEC analysis provided by a defendant. So I think we are at a turning point. The Commission needs to be put through its paces. But as Linsey indicates, taking an effects-based approach to the limits that some demand renders putting the efficacy of Article 102 at risk.
Thanks, Richard. I mean, both of your co-panelists have mentioned the AEC test, which obviously sits within a broader principle, the as efficient competitive principle, what competition law, who's it harming? So where do you think the AEC test and its principles sit now? When should it be deployed?
Yes. Well, I mean, this is a fundamentally important issue, and we've been talking about the as efficient competitor test now for quite a long time. But I think we've got to be very careful with this. We've got to sit down and think through what exactly it is that we're talking about. I mean, it's not good enough simply to say, oh, the as efficient competitor test, this contains the answer to the problems of abusive behaviour. Just as in the old days, it wasn't good enough to just say, Article 101 would be better if there was a rule of reason. What do we mean by these words? And it seems to me, and it's in your question, that there's a distinction between the as efficient competitor principle and the as efficient competitor test. These things are different, and I think people need to understand how and why they're different. So let's talk about the AEC principle to begin with. And I vividly remember in the 90s in particular, and going into the noughties, when there was this sort of ideological complaint about EU law on abuse of dominance, that it was being used to protect competitors, as though somehow that's why it was applied in cases. And I can remember the day of the Microsoft judgment in Luxembourg in 2007, which was at the time of the Fordham conference in New York. And the Tom Barnett, who was the head of the Antitrust division at the time, said, see, there you go again, you people in Europe, you protect competitors. We in the States protect competition. And there was this strong perception that there was this rift, this chasm between the two systems of law. And that's why I found the 2008 guidance 1 year after Microsoft so useful on the Commission's part, because it went out of its way there to explain competition is a ruthless process and there are winners and losers. And if a dominant firm prevails on the merits, and if other people get excluded from the market because they can't compete with that dominant firm on the merits, so be it. And there's no sentimentality systematically applied to, if you like, small and medium-sized businesses or inefficient businesses. And the Commission made that very clear in that guidance. And again, as I said earlier, that obviously inspired the Court of Justice itself, which on several occasions subsequently recognised that a dominant firm that eliminates competitors on the merits, that is absolutely fine. That's what happens in markets. So that's AEC as a principle. EU law does not systematically protect inefficient competitors. But then we've got AEC as a test. And this is a quite different matter. It's a methodology. And there are cases where you can apply price cost analysis, and it might be a very useful way of demonstrating that this conduct could eliminate an as efficient competitor. And the simplest, insofar as a case of predatory pricing can be described as simple, but the simplest case of that would be, here's the dominant firm, these are its prices, these are its costs, its prices are below the costs. Well, how could an efficient competitor compete with that? So you can apply the AEC test in that situation, and I think you can in margin squeeze as well. But what about other types of abuse? Can you apply this across the board? Should you apply this across the board? And I think the courts have handled this well. And they've said on several occasions now, there are cases where the AEC test is an appropriate methodology to use, but there may be other cases where it isn't appropriate, and anyway, there is no legal duty to apply it in all cases. And that came through in Post Denmark. It was said recently, I think, in Unilever. I think it's there in Intel, actually. The Court of Justice did not say that the evidence adduced by the DONCO or rebutted by the Commission necessarily has to be an AEC price cost analysis. You can try it, but there might be other ways of demonstrating anti-competitive foreclosure. And so, I mean, we're trying to get away from formalism. It seems to me if we were to have a legal rule that says that the AEC test has to be applied in all cases, that's exactly the kind of formalism that we don't want. And my final comment to make on all of this is, you know, we are trying to explore how you do effects analysis. And I think it has to be said that different cases may require different types of effect analysis, and the intensity and the evidence may be different from one case to another. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to this, which is actually why I think when the courts say sometimes you've got to look at all the relevant circumstances of the case, I mean, actually that must be right. There are some cases where it's not particularly useful to apply an AEC test.
Thank you, Thomas. Just to eke out the central point there, which is with the changes, is there a risk that Article 102 will be used to protect less efficient competitors, or do you think that there are less efficient market entrants who, by their nature, can't be as efficient as the big beast on the market yet, who present a competitive threat that it's worth protecting?
Yeah, well, that gets right to my fear. My fear actually is that Article 102 might be interpreted not to protect less efficient competitors when it is appropriate to protect them. I mean, so far the case law is clear that competition does need to be preserved by prohibiting conduct not on the merits that excludes less efficient competitors. I think the law is clear on that now. But there is a constant drumbeat by those seeking to make it the be-all and end-all of Article 102 that it should never protect less efficient competitors. I strongly agree with everything Richard has just said, and the Commission itself has clearly not lost sight of the basic point that Article 102 in principle is not meant to protect individual rivals from failure in a competitive market. But in many circumstances, not limited to those where a dominant company has inherited the advantages of a state monopoly, where many, if not all, of the competitors in a particular relevant market will inherently be less efficient than the dominant company. For example, when the dominant company benefits from overwhelming data scale effects, Google in search, for example, or where it benefits from enormous network effects, Microsoft in PC operating systems. And in cases like that, I think it can be critical to maintain the modicum of remaining competition, even if the competitors are less efficient than the dominant company in the market. And I'd ask, isn't it critical to prohibit conduct whereby a dominant company prevents smaller, less efficient competitors from grasping disruptive opportunities presented by market changes? The courts have said yes, for example, in Google Android with respect to the move from desktop to mobile search. So I endorse Linsey's point, which reflects the case law, that the presence of less efficient market competitors might contribute to intensifying the competitive pressure in a market, and that such competition needs to be preserved.
Richard, just to come back to you, you mentioned it earlier in one of your answers, what are effects? Now, if you look through the past judgments of the court and all their different language versions, we've got a cornucopia of possible views of effects: potential, possible, hypothetical, probable, likely to, tending to, and so forth. In its package, the Commission's gone for potential effects. Do you think that's right? And do you think it even matters?
Well, I think this is exactly where guidelines could be very useful, to be honest. Let's remember that we've got 50 years of jurisprudence here. I mean, commercial solvents and Continental Can were 50 years ago, and there have been a lot of judgments since then in which various verbal formulations have been used to address these kind of issues. And I think it's a muddle sometimes, really quite confusing. And, this is not to criticize the courts, because you have different courts at different times: Court of Justice, General Court, different chambers of courts, totally different types of abuse cases, and some of them are appeals from the Commission and other Article 267 references from national courts. And so a lot of language gets used over a period of time, and then it can be rather difficult to synthesize it all and make absolute sense of it. So I think that for the Commission to sort of reflect on what is there, and then to try to distill, I never know whether I mean the highest common factor or the lowest common denominator, but to try to make sense of it all and put it into some systematic guideline, I think would be very useful. A point I would make is that, again, we've got to unpack what we're talking about here with effects. Now, first of all, there's actual or potential effects. Now, to state the obvious, of course, Article 102 can apply to conduct that hasn't yet eliminated a competitor, but that might do in the future. It would be absurd to have an Article 102 that can only be used after the horse has bolted from the stable. So, of course, there's that sense of actual or potential effect. But that's a different question from the standard of proof that the Commission or the NCAs are subject to. And that's where your cornucopia seems to me to be the problem, because we've got likely to, probable, capable of, tends to. There are all of these different versions that one can find in the judgments, and it would be great, as I say, if you could come up with some common standard that's applied across the board. And quite frankly, if the Commission can do that, I would imagine that the courts themselves would very possibly welcome it, because they read their own judgments over history and must be a little bit confused at times. So I think this is absolutely an area where guidelines could be very useful.
Cornucopia or Tower of Babel, choose your metaphor. Linsey, just come back to you. So we've got the package in front of us. It's a new dawn, or we're heading into a new dawn. Two questions. What's different today than a couple of weeks ago with the immediate applicability of the changes? If there's a company out there trying to work out what's different now, how should I behave differently? What's the immediate effect of the guidance changes? And perhaps looking forward, conscious that you can't prejudge anything because there's a year or more of consultation to go on, but could you give us a sort of flavour about what you might expect in the guidelines package?
Well, look, in terms of practical effect of the amended guidance, I think we can look at it at two levels. I mean, I would hope that the fact that we've already updated the guidance on some of the key issues around about effects analysis is positive in terms of clarity and transparency. I would also hope, to use some competition law jargon, that it provides some nice focal points for the discussion on the guidelines, because that's going to be a really important part of the process going forward. And in terms of what we see changing now or changing in a post-guidelines world, I think it would be fair to expect a fair degree of continuity. My fellow panellists have made the point, I think, very eloquently, that the heavy lifting, in a sense, of the move from formalism towards an effects-based approach, that was the guidance from 2008. And I think it's produced very positive effects. And I really think it is now firmly embedded within the jurisprudence, and that essence is obviously something that we're going to maintain. So in a sense, to put it very simply, our starting point will remain an assessment of the reality of markets. We set out an analytical framework in the guidance which will remain true. We will want to look at the position of the dominant company, its competitors. We'll want to understand what's influencing competition in the market. We'll want to look at the coverage of the practice that we're investigating. We'll want to look at how the dynamics of competition in the market work and how that practice might interfere with them. So to that extent, I think there's a lot that will stay the same. If it comes to the content of the guidelines themselves, the answer is in your question that this is really very early days. We've had a call for evidence, and we'll be working towards putting out a draft set of guidelines for public comment in the middle of next year. So there's a very natural limit to how much I can advance on exactly what that document will contain. I think in terms of its structure, it would be reasonable to expect it to follow the steps of the analysis that the Commission is required to conduct. That's the normal structure of all of our guidelines. I think we will be wanting to cover all of the different types of exclusionary abuses that we've dealt with in our case practice and that we've seen translated into jurisprudence. We get one specific question in the call for evidence about whether self-preferencing will be dealt with as a self-standing abuse. So I'm already going to provide a non-answer to that, in that we're still thinking. But I think, above all, what we hear from stakeholders in the call for evidence is two things. That they think that guidelines would be valuable to the extent that they provide operational guidance for companies and their advisors, and the guidelines would be helpful to the extent that they provide legal certainty round about exclusionary abuses. And I think that those are two, if you like, of the guiding principles that will be very much at the forefront of our mind as we bring this process forward.
Thank you, Linsey. Okay, now it's over to you at home. We'll go to Slido to take our first questions. It's democratic, so vote up the good ones, vote down the bad ones. Who knows, if you vote them up high enough, you might get them in the guidelines. So, Lisa, you've got the most support for your first question, so let's take that. How can a dominant company assess if their conduct is harmful vis-a-vis not yet as efficient competitors in terms of quality, economies of scope, benefits of later entry rivals? So how can a dominant company assess if their conduct is harmful as regards as efficient competitors? Thomas, would you like to start with this?
How can a dominant company assess if their conduct is harmful versus not yet AEC in terms of quality, economics of scope, benefits of later entry rivals? Well, I'll readily admit it ain't going to be simple, but that is life. And I think one does need to start from the proposition that it's been the law for decades that if one is in a dominant position, one has a special responsibility not to distort or affect the existing competition. And so one needs to look very carefully at that. And I think that if a company does take that special responsibility seriously, and these kinds of companies know pretty well what's going on in their markets, they will be able to assess whether their conduct is going to have foreclosure effects on not as efficient competitors. That's a general answer to the question. I'm not going to be able to, as I sit here right now, give you very specific examples of how that could play out. But it ain't easy, but I do believe it can be done.
Linsey, do you have a comment on that?
Well, I think generally, in our experience, there are few companies that understand the competitive landscape in which they're operating as well as a dominant company. I think they have a very astute understanding of what it is their customers are looking for. I think they have a very astute understanding of what it is they need to do to meet that demand. And as I said earlier, when in their marketplace they feel that there's an emerging threat coming, I don't think that the immediate question they ask themselves is that company as efficient as I am in terms of cost, quality, or other parameters. So is this a straightforward exercise? It is not. That is why 102 is a question of complex economic assessments. But I think that dominant companies and their advisors are already conducting these complex economic assessments, and I don't see an enormous amount of change in terms of the practicality of that exercise.
Thank you, Linsey. Let's take the next question from Pietro. Don't you think that the justification of abuses has no legal basis in the treaty? Has the efficiency argument gone too far? Richard, has it?
It's a very nice question, and manifestly there is no Article 102.3 in the treaty. But we know from established case law now over a long period of time that the courts are willing to listen to efficiency arguments, also to objective justification arguments. And to be honest, I think it would be rather odd if you had a 101 with a 101.3, if you had merger guidelines that do recognise that efficiency arguments can be relevant to substantive analysis. It would be a bit odd if you were then to say when it comes to Article 102, there's no room for arguing efficiency whatsoever. So I can understand why the courts have effectively created a 102.3. The questioner asks, has the efficiency argument gone too far? My answer to that would be that I can't think of a commission decision in which an efficiency argument has been accepted in response to an accusation of abuse. So I find it difficult to agree that this has been taken too far. I think that's my conclusion on that one.
Thanks. Let's take the next one. From Anonymous, will Article 102 guidelines also cover exploitative abuses? If not, why? So This package is to do with exclusionary abuses, not exploitative, but the European Commission has in recent years started to explore exploitative more with statements of objections against the likes of Meta and Apple, which seem to rest on more exploitative theories. Isn't this a great opportunity to two birds with one stone, Linsey, do exploitative as well?
I think sometimes one should walk before you run. No, if you think back to all of the case law that we have on exclusionary conduct since 2008, I think that is already going to be quite an exercise to try to make that systemic and to try to draw as clear lines as possible in guidelines, which after all will be the Commission's attempt to produce a statement of the law. So I think our firm working hypothesis is that these guidelines will be focused on exclusionary conduct. You're right, of course, that whether it's at the level of the Commission or also our colleagues in national competition authorities, there is a bit of a shift out of the purely exclusionary case law into cases with more of an exploitative favour, and in particular through the prism of unfair trading conditions. But I think that we've got some experience to gain there and some case law to develop before it would make sense to think about guidelines in that particular area.
Thomas?
Maybe I can throw in a question to Linsey. It's absolutely clear that there's far less case law on exploitative abuses than on exclusionary ones, so I understand there isn't the same sort of basis for providing guidelines on exploitative abuses as you have in the exclusionary context. But might it, especially since you're clearly moving appropriately, I think, into the area of addressing exploitative abuses more intensely than you have for quite some years, and that's probably especially appropriate insofar as in the digital context, especially in the data-related context, there's an interaction between exploitative and exclusionary theories. Might you consider issuing guidance rather than guidelines like you did in 2008?
That's not something that's at the top of our mind for the time being, Thomas. I have to tell you honestly. I think to a large extent, when you're entering into territory that you haven't fully covered previously in case law, then it makes sense to really focus what you can learn from your case-by-case assessment in individual cases. And I think in the area of exploitative cases, that's what it's most reasonable to expect from the Commission, at least in the first instance.
Okay, I got my answer.
No immediate prospect of guidance on exploitative abuses, I'm afraid.
Richard, just come to you on that, both on the exploitative, but more generally, what's your wish list for the guidelines? Linsey mentioned or dodged the self-preferencing question. Obviously, sort of more classic things will be in there, but there are, as Thomas mentioned, data leveraging theories, self-preferencing theories, exploitative abuses. Would you like to see any of that in the guidelines?
Well, I mean, I've answered it to some extent already by saying I think these things like the standard of proof and so on, a lot more can be said about that. I would like the Commission to try to tell us the extent to which different effects analysis might be required in different cases. But then if we're coming to specific abuses, I think there are lots of things that are important to understand, an obvious one being Oscar Bronner. And when do you have a case in which Oscar Bronner has to be applied, and why is it not appropriate to apply it in other circumstances, the constructive refusal to deal issue? I think that it would be useful to unpack the jurisprudence to find out the kind of case in which the Commission might intervene on the basis of a not yet as efficient competitor, because I think one can begin to see that from cases, whether it's the network effects in a Google case or the historic monopoly situations that you have in something like Post Denmark. Obviously, there are lots of these other things, self-preferencing and so on. An area that I've always thought is terribly interesting is these abuse cases that you get, such as AstraZeneca, where somebody is accused of abusing a regulatory procedure, or something like disparagement cases that a lot of NCAs have done disparagement cases in recent years, and the Commission is doing a couple at the moment. Those are very interesting cases on which there's no guidance or guidelines at all at the moment, and I would think that they could usefully be discussed.
take one of your points there, Richard, and marry it with Konstantinos' question about constructive refusal to supply, which is essentially imposing unfair supply conditions, which we haven't yet covered in the opening. And just put it to Linsey, what's changed? Oscar Bronner's come up and the Bronner criteria, but you're saying that the full Bronner criteria are no longer applicable or needed in this circumstance. Is that right? Is that fair?
I think it's a fair reading of the case law, because these issues haven't only been dealt with by the Commission, they've also been dealt with by our courts in Luxembourg, including on appeal. So certainly our reading of Slovak Telecom, where the issue was completely on point, but also in Google Shopping, albeit the Commission's own theory of harm wasn't a constructive refusal to supply theory. But our reading of the case law is where a dominant company has already chosen to provide access, for whatever reason, then the Bronner criteria are not applicable. You've even seen the Advocate-General in Slovak Telecom make clear his view, at least, that is entirely irrelevant whether there's a regulatory requirement to provide access. In other words, the critical issue here is, has the dominant company itself chosen to provide access? If so, what the courts, it seems to me, tell us incontrovertibly is that there is no need to enter a speculative, hypothetical discussion round about whether the dominant company has an incentive to provide access, because they've chosen to do it.
Thanks. I'm going to take another question from Ruchit. Thomas, can I come to you with this one? Have we developed enforcement priorities with too much focus on the tech firms? Are we forgetting about abuses in non-tech markets? Thomas?
No. First of all, the tech cases are extremely important. The significance of technology companies in today's markets is greater than it ever has been before, so it's extremely important for the Commission to focus on it. But secondly, and Linsey might have numbers here, the Commission has issued plenty of Article 102 cases outside the tech sphere. I think that's the main answer to that question.
Richard?
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to say. I mean, if you look back on 102 cases over the last 10 years, there's plenty in the pharmaceutical sector,
Exactly.
and there are lots in utility sectors, and there are other cases as well. I mean, for example, there was AB InBev and the cans of beer, where there were attempts to prevent parallel trade from the Netherlands and France into Belgium, and the Commission's doing a case now which has a 102 element to it, which is Mondelez and chocolate, biscuits and coffee. I mean, that's quite a long way from tech markets. So, of course, we talk about the tech cases a lot because they're massive and it's new and it's difficult and so on and so forth. But there's lots of other cases going on, and Italian packaged ice cream from the AGCM in Rome.
Linsey, just put that to you. Are you swayed too much by the tech chatter and you don't spend enough time looking at the real economy?
I would certainly hope not. I think inevitably the tech cases are a little bit lightning rods. No, people such as yourself, Lewis, like to write about the tech cases. The tech cases perhaps bring antitrust out of the rarefied and into the more front page territory. That is incontrovertibly true, but it is very important to us that our enforcement is not focused on technology markets, and I think it is not. If I think about the pipeline of cases that we're developing at the moment, in this difficult cost of living situation in which we find ourselves, I think it's no surprise that we're focused very much on pharma, very much on basic industries, on consumer products. I think that makes a lot of sense, and it will be important that we continue in that vein.
Beer and energy drinks, which keep me happy
And
all times of the day.
And that is one of our important guiding principles, Lewis.
I think we've got time for another question. Come to you with this one, Linsey. Is the Commission going to take into account sustainability issues in assessing the exclusionary abuses in the guidelines? Perhaps, you obviously won't be able to talk about the guidelines, but the extent to which you will think about sustainability issues in looking at exclusionary abuses.
Yeah, look, I think sustainability in the sense of climate change, I mean, this is one of the challenges of our epoch. So, of course, in everything that we do, thinking about whether there's a sustainability angle is important to us. We'll be coming forward in the very near future with the new horizontals package, which will include for the first time a chapter in sustainability. So will this be relevant to our thinking in 102, as it will be in all other aspects of our conduct? Yes.
Still got another minute, so I'm going to leave 30 seconds each to Thomas and Richard, given you have personalised questions from the people at home. Thomas, you first. This is from someone else called Thomas. Could Mr. Vinje, it's a very polite place, Slido, could Mr. Vinje elaborate on his point that the fact that the DOMCO is a former state monopoly should play a role in the 102 assessment?
Well, there are cases where let's just call it a not as efficient competitor has disadvantages by virtue of the fact that a former state monopoly has inherited the advantages of the state monopoly, and that means that pretty much inherently the less efficient companies will be disadvantaged in the market, and that's been taken into account. I think that's all I was referring to.
Thanks. And Richard, you get the final word from Ronan. Richard mentioned guidance for 101 and merger guidance. Is there a need here for greater uniformity in the standard across 101, 102 and merger?
Well, I think I would like to think that there is a uniformity. I mean, in the end, all these three pillars of competition law, they are all concerned with the problem of market power or the acquisition of market power, or in some sense, the abuse of market power. And ultimately, I've always said that competition law in practice is the economic analysis of markets within a legal procedure. And I would like to think that the economic theories being applied and the economic evidence to be deployed would be the same no matter what legal instrument is being used. But so I would like to think that there is uniformity. As to whether there could be greater, well, maybe, I don't know. But
Thank you very much. So the hour's up. That's it. We'll call time on this first edition of Let's Talk Competition. I'd like to thank you all for taking part. I apologise if your questions weren't asked. That's my fault. I apologise if your questions weren't answered. That's their fault. Just to remind you that we have a year or more's worth of consultation coming up on this dossier, so you have plenty more opportunity to put your comments to the European Commission, and then in 2025, the guidance will come into force and the guidelines will come into force, and it's farewell to the guidance. So I'd just like to thank my panel for being here today, and thank you for watching. Thank you very much.